The British royal family has always been a symbol of tradition, resilience, and unshakable unity. For centuries, it has withstood wars, scandals, and shifting societal norms, maintaining its place as one of the most revered institutions in the world. But no amount of history or legacy could have prepared the monarchy for the storm that came with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's departure. Once celebrated as a modernizing force within the family, their exit in 2020 sent shockwaves through the palace and beyond. What began as a personal decision to carve out their own path has now spiraled into a relentless public feud, fueled by explosive interviews, tell-all books, and scathing documentaries. After years of turmoil, the royal family has had enough. Reports from insiders suggest that Prince William, backed by King Charles III, has delivered an ultimatum to Harry, one that may determine his future in the monarchy forever. Two demands, two non-negotiable conditions. Either Harry complies, or he faces permanent exile, not just from his royal duties, but from the family itself. No more olive branches, no more half-hearted reconciliations. This is the breaking point. The first demand is perhaps the most expected. Harry and Meghan must apologize, at least privately, for the damage they have inflicted on the royal family. For many, an apology might seem like a small price to pay for repairing such deeply fractured relationships. But for Harry and Meghan, who have built an entire brand around speaking their truth, an apology would be more than just an admission of wrongdoing. It would be an unraveling of their entire narrative. After years of painting themselves as the victims of an outdated and oppressive institution, could they really turn around and say they were wrong? The second demand is even more drastic. The couple must put an end to their public disclosures. No more memoirs, no more documentaries, no more interviews revealing palace secrets. The royal family is drawing a firm line, insisting that their private affairs remain just that, private. The release of Harry's memoir Spare in early 2023 sent the monarchy into crisis mode, revealing deeply personal conflicts, including his fractured bond with Prince William and his strained relationship with his father. If the Sussexes continue down this path, the monarchy fears that their very foundation could be weakened beyond repair. The choice is clear: loyalty to the family or permanent estrangement. To outsiders, these demands might appear as a desperate attempt by the royal family to silence dissent, but from the monarchy's perspective, this is a matter of survival. With public support for the institution wavering in recent years, scandals and controversy only serve to embolden those who believe the monarchy is an outdated relic that should be dismantled. If the royal family is to remain intact, it cannot afford to be a never-ending subject of scandal and betrayal at the hands of its own members. This ultimatum has set the stage for a dramatic turning point in the already contentious saga of Harry and Meghan versus the monarchy. What happens next could define not only their future but the future of the royal family itself. Will Harry and Meghan choose reconciliation, or will they cement their place as permanent outsiders? And if they refuse to comply, what drastic measures will the royal family take to enforce their decision? Stay with us as we unravel the complex dynamics, emotional stakes, and high-risk consequences behind this royal showdown. The clock is ticking, and the choices made in the coming months could change everything. When news of the royal family's ultimatum to Prince Harry first broke, reactions were swift and divided. Some saw it as a long-overdue measure, a necessary step to preserve the dignity of an institution that had been repeatedly dragged into controversy by one of its own. Others saw it as an unfair attempt to control and silence a man who had dared to break free from an outdated system. But regardless of public opinion, one thing was clear. This was no idle threat. The monarchy had drawn the line, and Harry was now at a crossroads with only two options before him. The ultimatum consisted of two non-negotiable conditions, both of which were meant to serve a singular purpose: to restore order and stability within the royal family. The first condition was a formal apology, at the very least, a private one. After years of public accusations, harsh revelations, and deeply personal criticisms leveled at the monarchy by Harry and Meghan, the royal family had decided that the only way forward was for the couple to take responsibility for the damage they had caused. The second condition was even more drastic: no more memoirs, no more documentaries, no more exposing palace secrets to the world. If the Sussexes wanted any chance of being accepted back into the fold, they would have to cease all public attacks, effective immediately. To understand why these demands were issued, one must look at the turbulent history between the Sussexes and the royal family. Tensions had been simmering long before Harry and Meghan's dramatic exit in 2020. Even during their time as senior royals, it was clear that Meghan's arrival had shaken the monarchy in a way that few newcomers had before. She was charismatic, outspoken, and media-savvy, traits that made her popular with a new generation but also raised concerns within the palace about her influence over Harry and the growing public perception that she was modernizing the monarchy too quickly. By the time Harry and Meghan announced their decision to step back from their roles and relocate to North America, the rift had already widened. However, what followed in the years after their departure turned what could have been a quiet separation into an all-out war. The infamous Oprah Winfrey interview in 2021 was the first major public blow. In it, the couple made shocking claims about racism within the palace, the lack of support Meghan received for her mental health struggles, and the alleged coldness with which they were treated by senior royals. The revelations painted a picture of a monarchy out of touch with reality, trapped in outdated traditions, and unwilling to protect its own. If the Oprah interview was a bombshell, Harry's memoir, Spare, was an all-out detonation. The book, released in early 2023, was more than just an autobiography. It was a deeply personal account of grievances, conflicts, and betrayals. In it, Harry detailed his strained relationship with Prince William, describing physical altercations and long-standing rivalries that shattered the public's perception of their once-close brotherly bond. He exposed private conversations with his father, King Charles, highlighting years of emotional neglect and a lack of understanding. He even delved into his feelings about his stepmother, Queen Camilla, suggesting that she had played a manipulative role in the family dynamics. The memoir was a bestseller, generating headlines for weeks and sparking endless debates about whether Harry had gone too far. While some sympathized with his experiences, others criticized him for airing private family matters in such an unapologetic manner. The palace, true to form, remained silent, refusing to respond to the accusations publicly. But behind closed doors, sources suggested that the revelations had caused irreparable damage. The trust that once existed between Harry and his family had been completely shattered. Then came the Netflix docuseries, an in-depth 6-part series chronicling Harry and Meghan's journey from royal life to their new reality in California. Once again, the couple did not hold back. They spoke of feeling betrayed by the palace, of being trapped in a system that did not care for their well-being, and of the relentless tabloid attacks they endured with little to no support from the firm. Meghan, in particular, described how she felt abandoned during her most vulnerable moments, emphasizing how alone she had been despite being part of one of the most powerful families in the world. By the time the series ended, one thing was clear: Harry and Meghan had made a conscious decision to continue speaking their truth, regardless of the consequences. And that was the breaking point for the royal family. The decision to issue an ultimatum was not made lightly. For years, the monarchy had employed its age-old strategy of maintaining silence in the face of controversy, believing that dignity and restraint would eventually win over public opinion. But this time, the situation had escalated beyond what silence could fix. The Sussexes were not just giving interviews or making occasional remarks. They had turned their experiences into a full-fledged media enterprise, profiting off their royal connections while simultaneously tearing the institution apart. The royal family knew that allowing this to continue would mean further erosion of their credibility. If Harry and Meghan kept speaking out, there was no telling what other damaging revelations might come next. Private conversations, internal conflicts, personal details, everything was fair game. And with each new disclosure, the monarchy's ability to maintain its carefully curated image weakened. The palace could no longer afford to be reactive. It had to take control of the narrative before it was too late. The first step was demanding an apology. From the monarchy's perspective, this was not about forcing Harry and Meghan to admit they were lying. It was about accountability. The damage had been done, but a genuine expression of regret, even if done privately, could pave the way for reconciliation. It could show that Harry, despite his criticisms, still valued his family enough to acknowledge the pain he had caused. It could be the first step toward healing a deeply fractured bond. But would Harry ever agree to such a demand? For years, He had positioned himself as someone fighting against an oppressive system. He had repeatedly spoken about his family's unwillingness to change, their refusal to acknowledge their faults, and their inability to offer support when it mattered most. Would apologizing contradict everything he had stood for? Would it make him appear weak, or worse, complicit in the very system he had spent years trying to dismantle? The second demand, ending all public disclosures, was perhaps even more difficult to accept. At this point, Harry and Meghan had built an entire brand around their royal fallout. They had signed multimillion-dollar deals with publishers and streaming platforms, all based on the promise of revealing the truth behind their departure. If they agreed to stop, what would happen to those contracts? What would happen to their relevance? Would they fade into the background, overshadowed by the very institution they had fought so hard to escape? And yet, the stakes were clear. If they refused to comply, the royal family would sever ties permanently. No more invitations, no more behind-the-scenes negotiations, no more room for potential reconciliation. Harry, once a beloved prince, would become nothing more than an outsider looking in. The choice before him was impossible: reconcile with his family and risk losing the independence he had fought so hard to gain, or continue down his current path and risk being permanently cut off. As the world watched in anticipation, one question loomed large: what would Prince Harry do? The demand for an apology was not just a matter of formality. It was a test of character, an ultimatum wrapped in a desperate attempt to restore peace within the royal family. But the request itself raised a crucial question: could Prince Harry and Meghan Markle ever truly apologize? And even if they did, would it be enough to repair the damage that had already been done? For the royal family, an apology represented the first necessary step toward healing. The monarchy operates on a foundation of duty, loyalty, and the unspoken understanding that personal grievances must never outweigh the greater good of the institution. From their perspective, Harry and Meghan's actions had shattered that understanding. Their public disclosures, allegations, and relentless criticism of the monarchy had left wounds so deep that silence was no longer a sufficient response. The palace needed closure, and an apology was the only way to get it. But for Harry and Meghan, saying sorry was not so simple. Their entire journey had been built around the idea of speaking their truth. From the moment they stepped away from royal life, they positioned themselves as victims of a system that had failed them, emotionally, mentally, and in Meghan's case, racially. They had risked everything to escape what they saw as an oppressive, outdated monarchy that prioritized tradition over the well-being of its own members. For them to now turn around and apologize would mean admitting that their entire narrative had been flawed, that perhaps they had been unfair in their accusations, or at the very least, that their actions had caused harm. Throughout history, apologies within the royal family have been rare, often reserved for extreme circumstances. The monarchy is built on the idea of stoic resilience, a belief that showing vulnerability, especially in public, undermines their authority. This is why Queen Elizabeth II rarely, if ever, issued public apologies during her reign. She understood that every admission of wrongdoing could be interpreted as weakness, a chink in the armor of an institution that depended on its image of stability and control. But this situation was different. The royal family was not asking Harry and Meghan to apologize publicly. They were asking for a private acknowledgement, a behind-the-scenes reconciliation that would never need to be spoken about outside of palace walls. The question was whether such an apology would ever feel sincere. To fully grasp the weight of this demand, one must consider Harry's personal grievances that, in his mind, made an apology feel undeserved. He had spent years harboring resentment toward the institution, particularly after the death of his mother, Princess Diana. From his perspective, the royal family had failed to protect Diana, allowing the media to hound her until the tragic night she lost her life. That wound never truly healed, and it only deepened as he saw history repeating itself with Meghan. During his interview with Oprah Winfrey, Harry described how helpless he felt watching Meghan struggle under the same pressures his mother had endured. He accused the royal family of being complicit in Meghan's suffering, refusing to step in when she needed help the most. In his mind, they owed him an apology, not the other way around. But the royal family saw things differently. To them, Harry and Meghan had crossed a line when they took their grievances public. Criticism within the family was one thing. Disagreements, arguments, and personal frustrations were inevitable in any family, let alone one as complex as the monarchy. But airing those grievances to the world, in tell-all interviews, memoirs, and documentaries, was an act of betrayal. It broke an unspoken rule. The monarchy handles its problems privately. The demand for an apology was not just about repairing relationships, it was about restoring dignity. The monarchy had been humiliated, ridiculed, and forced to endure intense scrutiny because of Harry and Meghan's revelations. The palace staff had been accused of racism. Prince William had been painted as an aggressor, King Charles as emotionally distant, and Queen Camilla as manipulative. These were not just passing remarks. They were accusations that would follow the family for years, tarnishing their legacies. Would a private apology undo all of that damage? Likely not. But for the royal family, it would at least be a start. Meghan's perspective on this issue was even more complicated. She had always positioned herself as someone who stood by her principles, someone who refused to conform to expectations that did not align with her values. In the past, she had spoken openly about the struggles she faced in the royal system, how she felt silenced, how her concerns were dismissed, how she was left to fend for herself against brutal media attacks. If she were to apologize, would it be perceived as an admission that she had exaggerated or even fabricated some of those struggles? For someone who had built a reputation as a strong, independent woman who refused to be silenced, an apology could feel like a step backward. It could be interpreted as submission, as a reluctant surrender to an institution that, in her eyes, had wronged her from the start. But Meghan was also pragmatic. She understood the power of public perception. An apology, even a private one, could open doors that had previously been slammed shut. It could pave the way for future invitations to royal events, allowing her children, Archie and Lilibet, to have some form of connection to their grandfather and extended family. It could soften the hostility between her and the rest of the royals, creating an opportunity for cautious reconciliation. Yet, even with these potential benefits, the risks were undeniable. Would an apology make Meghan look like a hypocrite? Would it weaken her and Harry's brand, which was built on their willingness to speak out against injustice? Would their most loyal supporters feel betrayed if they were to backtrack, even slightly, on the narrative they had so strongly upheld? The royal family, in their demand for an apology, was not merely asking for words. They were asking for an act of submission, a concession that would reframe the entire saga. If Harry and Meghan apologized, it would be an acknowledgement that they had caused harm, that their words had consequences, that perhaps they had been unfair in their portrayal of the monarchy. It would be a powerful moment, one that could either heal wounds or create new ones. And yet, for all the emotional weight surrounding this demand, there was another question that loomed just as large. Even if Harry and Meghan agreed to apologize, how would the royal family respond? Would they truly accept the apology and move forward? Or would it merely serve as a symbolic gesture, with no real change in how they treated the couple? Would an apology be enough? The demand had been made, but the response was far from certain. The Sussexes had built their post-royal lives on their truth, on their willingness to challenge the monarchy and break away from its control. Now, they were being asked to take a step back, to soften their stance, to offer an act of conciliation that could redefine everything. It was not just a question of whether they could apologize. It was a question of whether they would. The second demand of the royal family's ultimatum was clear and absolute. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle must stop all public disclosures about the monarchy. No more memoirs. No more Netflix documentaries. No more revealing interviews that expose palace secrets to the world. If they wanted any hope of reconciliation, they would have to walk away from the very narrative that had defined their post-royal existence. This demand was not just about silencing them. It was about drawing a firm line in the sand. For years, the royal family had followed an unspoken rule. Family matters were dealt with privately, behind closed doors. No matter the conflicts, no matter the tensions, public exposure was never an option. But Harry and Meghan had broken that rule in the most spectacular fashion, turning their grievances into a global spectacle that reshaped how the world viewed the monarchy. The release of Harry's memoir Spare was a turning point. It was not just another celebrity autobiography. It was a deep, unfiltered dive into royal life, written from the perspective of a prince who felt betrayed, neglected, and misunderstood. Every page carried a new revelation, from personal feuds with Prince William to strained interactions with King Charles. The world was given a front-row seat to the most private moments of the royal family, moments that were never meant to be shared beyond the palace walls. The book made headlines for weeks, selling millions of copies within days of its release. It was a publishing phenomenon, a financial success that ensured Harry's voice would not only be heard but amplified across the world. But for the royal family, it was a catastrophe. The monarchy had always operated on a carefully managed image, an image of stability, control, and unwavering dignity. Spare shattered that illusion. It made the royal institution look fragile, dysfunctional, and deeply divided. Every personal detail, every argument, every accusation added another crack to the carefully constructed facade. It wasn't just a tell-all. It was a weapon, wielded by Harry in a battle that the royal family had never wanted to fight. And yet, the memoir was only one part of the problem. The Netflix docuseries that followed was just as damaging, if not more so. When the series was announced, many expected it to be a simple recounting of Harry and Meghan's journey, a documentary that would shed light on their struggles and triumphs. But what the world got was something far more revealing. Over the course of several episodes, the couple laid bare their experiences with the monarchy, describing a system that, in their eyes, had failed them at every turn. They spoke of feeling abandoned, of being trapped in an institution that prioritized its own image over the well-being of its members. They described the suffocating pressure, the relentless media scrutiny, the lack of support when they needed it most. And, once again, they pointed fingers at the palace, at the courtiers, at the very family they had once been a part of. The series was emotional, raw, and undeniably compelling. But for the royal family, it was yet another betrayal. It reinforced the idea that Harry and Meghan were not just distancing themselves from the monarchy. They were actively working against it. By the time both the book and the documentary had made their impact, the royal family realized that this was not a temporary phase. Harry and Meghan had built an entire brand around their departure from the firm. Their interviews, their projects, their public image, all of it was centered around their royal past and the pain that came with it. This was the real issue behind the second demand of the ultimatum. The royal family was not just asking Harry and Meghan to stop talking. They were asking them to dismantle an entire aspect of their identity, to stop writing, to stop filming, to stop giving interviews meant to sever the very thing that had made them globally relevant after leaving royal life. For Meghan, the answer was complicated. Since stepping away from the monarchy, she had positioned herself as an advocate for women's rights, mental health, and social justice. She had launched a podcast, taken on various philanthropic efforts, and built a public image that extended beyond her royal ties. But no matter how much she tried to redefine herself, her connection to the royal family remained at the core of public interest. People were not just interested in Meghan Markle, the activist. They were interested in Meghan Markle, the Duchess who walked away. Ending public disclosures about the royal family meant losing the most powerful aspect of their narrative. Without it, their projects would no longer carry the same weight. Their stories would no longer be as compelling. Would people still tune in if the stories weren't about palace drama, but instead about Meghan's latest initiative or Harry's charity work? That was the risk they faced. Then, there was the financial aspect. Harry and Meghan had signed multimillion-dollar deals with Netflix, Spotify, and various publishers. These deals were built on the promise of exclusive content, of inside stories that only they could tell. Walking away from royal disclosures meant potentially breaching contracts or, at the very least, losing their strongest selling point. Yet, despite these risks, the royal family was firm. This was not a negotiation. If Harry and Meghan wanted any hope of repairing their relationships within the monarchy, they had to let go of the past and move forward without dragging the institution into public scrutiny again. The question now was whether they were willing to do so. For Harry, the decision was personal. He had spent years feeling unheard, feeling like his voice was always overshadowed by the expectations placed upon him. Speaking out had given him a sense of freedom, a way to reclaim his story after years of feeling controlled. But with this ultimatum, he was being asked to give that up. Could he do it? Or had he gone too far down this path to turn back? The weight of this demand was not just about stopping a book or a documentary. It was about erasing a version of themselves that had become central to their new lives. And if they refused, the consequences would be irreversible. Would Harry and Meghan make that sacrifice? Or would they choose to walk away, knowing they would never be welcomed back into the royal fold? The answer remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. This ultimatum had changed everything. What they decided next could define their future forever. From the moment Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped away from their royal duties, the British monarchy faced a crisis unlike any it had encountered in modern history. The departure itself was not the issue. Other royals had distanced themselves from the crown before. What made this situation uniquely volatile was the couple's decision to take their grievances to the public, repeatedly exposing the private struggles and internal conflicts of the royal family. For a long time, the palace tried to manage the situation using its traditional approach: silence. The monarchy had always functioned on the principle that dignity and restraint were the best ways to weather any storm. Scandals came and went, but the firm, as it was known, remained unshaken because it refused to be drawn into public disputes. But with Harry and Meghan, this strategy was failing. The monarchy's refusal to engage in a war of words with the Sussexes had not made the problem go away. If anything, it had emboldened Harry and Meghan, who took the silence as proof that they were being ignored and mistreated. Every new revelation, whether in interviews, books, or documentaries, further fueled the perception that the royal family was out of touch and unwilling to address its internal problems. The damage to the monarchy's reputation was undeniable. For King Charles III, this crisis came at the worst possible time. His ascension to the throne following Queen Elizabeth II's death marked the beginning of a new era, one that was already facing scrutiny. Public support for the monarchy had been declining, with growing movements questioning whether the institution should even continue to exist. Younger generations, in particular, were less attached to the idea of a royal family, viewing it as an outdated system that had little relevance in modern society. Against this backdrop, the ongoing feud with Harry and Meghan was a major distraction. Instead of focusing on strengthening his reign and solidifying his legacy, King Charles found himself constantly dealing with the fallout from his younger son's public criticisms. This was not the kind of reign he had envisioned. Prince William, too, was deeply affected by the ongoing conflict. As the future king, his role was not just to prepare for his eventual rule, but to protect the monarchy in the present. And in his eyes, Harry's actions were doing irreparable harm. The relationship between the two brothers had once been one of the strongest in the royal family. They had leaned on each other during their mother's tragic death, navigating the overwhelming expectations placed upon them as young royals. But over time, cracks had formed, deepening as their lives took different paths. William had embraced his duty, accepting the sacrifices that came with his role as the future king. Harry, on the other hand, had grown increasingly resentful of those same expectations, feeling like he was living in William's shadow. When Harry left the monarchy, William was deeply hurt. But when Harry began publicly criticizing the family, that hurt turned into something far more serious: anger. William saw his brother's actions as an unforgivable betrayal, a reckless disregard for the very institution that had shaped their lives. And while the palace had remained silent in the face of Harry's accusations, William was reportedly among those pushing hardest for the firm stance that ultimately led to the ultimatum. For him, the issue was not just about personal grievances. It was about the survival of the monarchy. If Harry and Meghan were allowed to continue their public disclosures, what would stop future royals from doing the same? What would prevent the monarchy from becoming nothing more than a reality show, where private conflicts were aired for public entertainment? The Queen Consort, Camilla, also played a role in shaping the royal family's response. Having spent years rehabilitating her own image following the controversy surrounding Princess Diana, Camilla understood better than most how damaging public scrutiny could be. She had endured years of being vilified in the media, yet she had navigated that storm by remaining silent and letting time change the narrative. From her perspective, engaging in a public battle with Harry and Meghan was a mistake. The best way to handle the situation was to set firm boundaries and enforce them without fanfare. If Harry and Meghan wanted to reconcile, they would have to do so on the monarchy's terms, not through the media, not through tell-all books, but privately, in a way that preserved the dignity of the institution. Another key factor behind the ultimatum was the impact of Harry and Meghan's actions on the royal staff and the extended family. While much of the media attention focused on the main members of the royal family, there were countless individuals behind the scenes, advisors, aides, security teams, who had been caught in the crossfire. Many of these individuals had been directly criticized in the Sussexes' public statements, accused of racism, cruelty, and indifference. For the monarchy, protecting these individuals was just as important as protecting its own image. If the royal family allowed continued public attacks, it would set a dangerous precedent, one that suggested that anyone associated with the institution could be publicly condemned without consequence. Timing was another major reason why the ultimatum had to happen now. With King Charles's reign still in its early stages, the palace wanted to ensure that his leadership was not defined by the Harry and Meghan controversy. If the issue dragged on for years, it would overshadow everything else the monarchy was trying to accomplish. The focus needed to shift away from family drama and back to the institution's role in public service, diplomacy, and governance. By issuing the ultimatum, the royal family was sending a clear message. The time for negotiations was over. The monarchy was no longer willing to tolerate public attacks, no matter who they came from. But this approach carried risks. There was always the possibility that Harry and Meghan would reject the ultimatum outright, choosing to go even further in their public criticisms. The royal family had no way of controlling their next move, no guarantee that cutting them off completely would put an end to the controversy. If anything, it could escalate the situation, leading to even more damaging revelations. Yet, the palace had decided that it was a risk worth taking. The institution had survived centuries of scandal, betrayals, and internal conflicts. It had outlasted wars, revolutions, and changing public opinions. It would survive this too, but only if it took decisive action. The ultimatum was not just about Harry and Meghan. It was about setting a precedent for the future. It was about ensuring that the monarchy remained an institution that commanded respect, not one that was constantly embroiled in public disputes. Now, the question remained, how would Harry and Meghan respond? Would they see this ultimatum as an opportunity for reconciliation, or would they see it as an unfair demand meant to silence them? And if they refused, what would the royal family do next? The stage was set for a decision that could change everything. The monarchy had made its move. Now, it was Harry and Meghan's turn to decide their fate. The moment news broke that the royal family had issued an ultimatum to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, reactions from around the world were swift, polarized, and deeply passionate. The monarchy's demand that Harry and Meghan apologize and cease all public disclosures about the royal institution sparked a heated debate. Was this a justified step toward protecting the legacy of the monarchy, or was it an attempt to silence two individuals who had only ever spoken their truth? The world was divided, and as public opinion began to take shape, it became evident that this was not just a royal family dispute. It was a cultural battle between tradition and modernity. The reaction in Britain was particularly strong. The British press, which had long been critical of Harry and Meghan's decision to step away from royal duties, largely sided with the monarchy. Newspapers like the Daily Mail and The Sun framed the ultimatum as an essential measure to safeguard the dignity of the royal family. Editorials emphasized that Harry and Meghan had been given too much freedom to tarnish the monarchy's reputation, and that it was about time King Charles and Prince William took a firm stand. Royal commentators argued that if the couple wished to remain connected to the family in any way, they had to respect its traditions and rules. The message was clear: enough was enough. For many Britons, particularly those who had always supported the monarchy, the ultimatum felt like a necessary correction after years of watching Harry and Meghan undermine the institution that had given them their titles and privileges. To them, the couple's repeated public criticisms had been an act of betrayal, and allowing them to continue without consequences would only embolden them to further damage the royal legacy. Supporters of the royal family believed that the ultimatum was not about revenge, but about preserving the integrity of the monarchy for future generations. However, not everyone in Britain shared this perspective. A significant portion of the public, especially younger generations, saw the ultimatum as heavy-handed and indicative of the monarchy's unwillingness to modernize. Social media platforms were flooded with debates about whether the royal family was being fair or simply trying to control Harry and Meghan by forcing them into silence. Many questioned why the monarchy had chosen this moment to draw the line, especially when past royal scandals, some far more damaging, had been handled with far more discretion. Why, they asked, was the same energy not applied to other members of the royal family who had faced controversies? Across the Atlantic, the reaction in the United States was markedly different. Harry and Meghan had found strong support in America ever since their departure from royal duties. Many Americans viewed them as a modern couple who had chosen personal freedom over an oppressive institution. To them, the ultimatum felt like an attempt to suppress free speech, a move that went against everything the United States stood for. Prominent media figures, talk show hosts, and Hollywood celebrities weighed in, with many defending the Sussexes and criticizing the royal family for what they saw as an outdated approach to dealing with dissent. American media outlets such as the New York Times and CNN took a more sympathetic stance toward Harry and Meghan, questioning whether the royal family had truly learned anything from past mistakes. Analysts pointed out that the monarchy had historically struggled with handling internal conflicts, often choosing to exile rather than engage. Some drew parallels to the way Princess Diana had been treated, suggesting that the institution had failed to evolve in the decades since her tragic death. To many Americans, the ultimatum felt like a desperate attempt by an old institution to cling to its power rather than genuinely resolve underlying issues. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of opinion. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok saw heated debates between royalists and Sussex supporters. Hashtags like #StandWithHarry and Meghan and #RoyalFamilyUltimatum began trending, with users dissecting every angle of the situation. Some posted clips from Harry and Meghan's past interviews, arguing that their grievances were justified and that the royal family was simply proving their point by trying to silence them. Others shared historical examples of how the monarchy had previously handled crises, questioning whether this ultimatum would truly be effective or if it would backfire. Beyond Britain and the United States, the global response was equally varied. In Commonwealth nations like Canada, Australia, and South Africa, opinions were split. Some saw the ultimatum as necessary, a way to enforce the structure that had kept the monarchy intact for centuries. Others felt it was a confirmation that the royal family was unwilling to embrace real change. In nations where debates about cutting ties with the monarchy were already underway, the ultimatum was used as evidence that the British crown was out of step with the modern world. Political figures in Australia and Jamaica, who had been advocating for full independence from the monarchy, cited the controversy as yet another reason why their countries should reconsider their ties to the British crown. Meanwhile, European media took a more analytical approach. French, German, and Spanish outlets examined the situation through the lens of historical royal conflicts, comparing it to past instances where European monarchies had faced internal divisions. Historians were called upon to discuss the long-term implications, debating whether this moment would be remembered as a turning point for the British monarchy or simply another chapter in its turbulent history. One of the most significant questions being asked was whether this ultimatum would even work. Would Harry and Meghan comply, or would they choose to defy the monarchy once again? Many speculated that the couple's response would determine whether the situation escalated further. If they agreed to apologize and cease their public disclosures, it could signal the beginning of a fragile truce. But if they refused, it could mean the final, irrevocable break between Harry and his family. The potential consequences of defiance were also widely discussed. What would the royal family do if Harry and Meghan ignored the ultimatum? Would they strip them of their titles? Would they cut off all remaining financial support? Would they go as far as legally disowning Harry in an effort to sever ties completely? These questions fueled further debate, with many wondering if the royal family was prepared to follow through on such drastic measures. Amid all the speculation, there was also a deeper conversation about what this entire ordeal meant for the future of the monarchy. Some argued that the royal family's rigid stance was only making matters worse, pushing Harry and Meghan further away and alienating a younger, more progressive audience. Others believed that the monarchy had no choice but to take a stand, lest it risk losing credibility entirely. One thing was certain. This ultimatum had set the stage for a defining moment in royal history. Whether it would lead to reconciliation or total estrangement remained to be seen, but the world was watching, waiting for Harry and Meghan's next move. The question now was simple. Would they bend, or would they break? The ultimatum had been issued, the battle lines drawn. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stood at a crossroads, faced with a decision that would define their future and determine the fate of their relationship with the royal family. The choice before them was deceptively simple: comply with the royal family's demands or refuse and face the consequences. But the implications of either decision were far from straightforward. Each path carried significant risks, each outcome unpredictable. The world watched with anticipation, wondering which direction the Sussexes would take. The first possible outcome was the most straightforward. Harry and Meghan could choose to comply. They could privately apologize to the royal family, acknowledging the pain their public disclosures had caused, and they could agree to cease all future tell-alls, documentaries, and memoirs. This would be the most immediate way to repair the fractured relationship between Harry and his family, potentially paving the way for reconciliation. If they chose this path, the royal family would likely respond in kind. Relations would slowly begin to heal, allowing for a gradual reintegration of Harry into the fold, even if not in an official working royal capacity. Meghan, too, might find a softer reception, with the palace making efforts to at least appear conciliatory. This could mean invitations to major royal events, the opportunity for Archie and Lilibet to have a relationship with their cousins, and the possibility of private family gatherings that had been absent since their departure. But would such a reconciliation be genuine, or would it merely be a surface-level truce, designed to maintain public appearances? The reality was that too much damage had already been done for things to return to the way they once were. The trust that had been shattered could not be easily rebuilt, and even if an apology was given, there would always be lingering resentment on both sides. Harry and Meghan's decision to go public with their grievances had created deep wounds within the royal family, wounds that an apology alone might not be enough to heal. There was also the question of whether Harry and Meghan could truly walk away from their public narrative. Their brand had been built on speaking their truth, on revealing the inner workings of the monarchy, and on positioning themselves as the modern alternative to the rigid traditions of the royal family. If they agreed to stop discussing the monarchy altogether, what would that mean for their future projects? Would they still have the same level of public interest if they no longer had new royal revelations to share? And more importantly, would they be willing to give up the financial deals that had been centered around their story? The second possible outcome was one of partial compliance. Instead of outright refusing the ultimatum, Harry and Meghan could attempt to negotiate a middle ground. They might offer a carefully worded apology, acknowledging that their words had caused pain without completely retracting their statements. They could agree to limit future disclosures without fully shutting down their ability to speak on issues they felt strongly about. This approach would allow them to maintain some level of independence while also showing a willingness to mend fences. It could create enough of a compromise to prevent complete estrangement, keeping communication lines open between Harry and the royal family while still allowing the Sussexes to maintain their public platform. However, this outcome would likely lead to continued tension. If the royal family viewed the apology as half-hearted or insincere, it could deepen the rift rather than heal it. Likewise, if Harry and Meghan continued to make public statements that even remotely referenced the monarchy, the palace might perceive it as a breach of trust, leading to further fallout. The third possible outcome was complete rejection of the ultimatum. Harry and Meghan could decide that they had already sacrificed enough, that they owed the royal family nothing, and that they would not be silenced. This would be the most dramatic choice, and one that would almost certainly lead to permanent exile from the monarchy. If they refused to apologize and continued their public disclosures, the royal family would have little choice but to enforce consequences. This could mean stripping them of their remaining royal titles, cutting off any lingering financial ties, and making it clear that they were no longer welcome in royal circles. Harry and Meghan would become true outsiders, fully separated from the institution they had once been part of. But such a decision would not come without risks. While rejecting the ultimatum would solidify their independence, it could also alienate them further from the British public. Already, their approval ratings in the UK had declined due to their repeated criticisms of the monarchy. By refusing to compromise, they could find themselves increasingly isolated, with dwindling support from those who once sympathized with their cause. There was also the personal cost to consider. No matter how strained the relationship had become, Harry had once been deeply close to his family. The thought of never being able to reconcile with his father or brother, of being forever shut out from family gatherings, could weigh heavily on him. For Meghan, too, the impact of being permanently estranged from the royal family could have consequences for her children, who might grow up without a connection to their royal relatives. Yet, if Harry and Meghan believed that their principles were more important than family ties, they might decide that complete separation was the only viable path forward. They could continue to carve out their own legacy, free from the constraints of royal expectations, and focus on their own initiatives without the constant shadow of the monarchy looming over them. A fourth and more unpredictable outcome was that of escalation. If Harry and Meghan refused to comply but did not outright reject the royal family, tensions could continue to build, leading to an even more public confrontation. The royal family, frustrated by the lack of resolution, might begin to take more aggressive steps to control the narrative, potentially leaking more information to the press or using legal avenues to prevent further disclosures. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan, feeling cornered, could decide to respond in kind, further exposing palace secrets in retaliation. This would turn an already tense situation into an all-out battle, with each side attempting to protect their reputation while dismantling the credibility of the other. Such a scenario would not only be damaging to both parties, but could also permanently alter the way the public viewed the monarchy itself. Ultimately, the path Harry and Meghan chose would shape their future in profound ways. The ultimatum had forced them into a position where they had to make a definitive choice: reconciliation or complete estrangement. There was no easy answer, no perfect solution that would satisfy all parties involved. But one thing was certain: whatever decision they made, the consequences would be lasting. Would they choose to rebuild bridges, or would they burn them once and for all? The world waited to find out. Beyond the political maneuvering, public scrutiny, and calculated decisions, there was an intensely personal dimension to the royal family's ultimatum. At the heart of this conflict was not just a monarchy trying to preserve its image or a rebellious prince fighting for his own voice. It was a family in crisis. A family that had been torn apart by years of unresolved wounds, deep-seated resentment, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal on both sides. For Prince Harry, the emotional burden of this situation was perhaps heavier than anyone truly understood. No matter how far he had distanced himself from his royal past, the people demanding an apology from him were still his father, his brother, and the family that had shaped his entire existence. These were not just institutional figures. They were the people he had grown up with, the ones he had shared his happiest and most painful moments with. The ultimatum forced Harry to confront an impossible dilemma. On one hand, apologizing and complying with the royal family's demands would be an acknowledgement that he had, in some way, been wrong. It would mean admitting that his words had caused harm, even if he still believed they were justified. On the other hand, refusing to apologize would mean accepting the possibility that his family might never fully welcome him back. It could mean a permanent break, one that he might regret for the rest of his life. But was an apology really about healing, or was it about submission? That was the question Harry had to grapple with. For years, he had felt unheard, as though his concerns and experiences were dismissed the moment they clashed with the monarchy's interests. His decision to step away from royal life had been an act of reclaiming control, a way to prioritize his own well-being after years of suppressing his frustrations. To apologize now, especially if it was just to meet the royal family's demands, felt like undoing everything he had fought for. At the same time, there was a part of Harry that longed for reconciliation. No matter how much anger or resentment existed, he could not erase the memories of growing up in the palace, of the bond he once shared with William, or of the complicated but loving relationship he had with his father. The thought of never repairing those relationships was not something he could easily accept. For Meghan Markle, the situation was equally complex, though for different reasons. Unlike Harry, she had never truly been part of the royal family in the same way. She had entered as an outsider, married into a centuries-old institution that was resistant to change, and quickly became the center of intense media scrutiny. Her experience within the monarchy had been brief but deeply traumatic. She had felt silenced, unsupported, and ultimately abandoned when she needed help the most. The ultimatum put Meghan in a difficult position. While Harry's decision would ultimately determine their next steps, she was fully aware that any action he took would also impact her and their children. If they chose to apologize and comply, would it mean re-entering a world that had already rejected them once? Could she ever trust the royal family again after everything that had happened? Meghan had spent years rebuilding her life outside of the monarchy, establishing herself as a public figure separate from the royal narrative. To turn back now, to concede to the royal family's demands, could feel like erasing all the progress she had made. Yet, at the same time, she knew that a permanent estrangement would have consequences not just for her and Harry, but for their children, Archie and Lilibet. For Archie and Lilibet, the emotional weight of this battle was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of all. They were too young to understand the complexities of royal politics or the long history of tension between their parents and the monarchy. But as they grew older, they would inevitably have questions. Why didn't they see their grandfather, King Charles? Why weren't they part of royal celebrations? Why were they raised with a connection to royalty but without a place within it? Harry and Meghan had always expressed a desire to give their children a life free from the pressures of royal duty, but that did not mean they wanted them to grow up without a connection to their extended family. The ultimatum, in many ways, forced them to choose between their personal convictions and their children's potential future within the royal circle. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, the emotional fallout extended beyond Harry and Meghan. For King Charles, this was not just about protecting the monarchy, it was about his son. No matter how much frustration or disappointment he felt, no father truly wants to lose his child. Charles had spent his entire life preparing for the throne, understanding that duty must always come before personal feelings. But now, as king, he faced a situation where duty and fatherhood were at odds. If Harry refused to comply with the ultimatum, would Charles be able to accept cutting him off completely? Could he truly disown his own son for the sake of preserving the institution? The weight of this decision was immense, and for a man who had already lost one great love in his life with the death of Princess Diana, the prospect of permanently losing his youngest son was not an easy reality to face. For Prince William, the emotional stakes were just as high. The breakdown of his relationship with Harry had been one of the most painful aspects of this entire saga. They had once been inseparable, bound together not just by blood but by shared experiences, particularly the trauma of losing their mother at a young age. William had always expected that no matter what happened, they would stand by each other. But now, the chasm between them felt insurmountable. Unlike Charles, who had to balance his role as king with his role as a father, William's focus was on protecting the monarchy above all else. As the future king, he had more at stake than anyone. If the monarchy was to survive for future generations, it needed to remain respected, untainted by personal disputes turned into public scandals. To William, Harry had crossed a line that could never be undone. Yet, beneath the anger and frustration, there was still a lingering pain. The pain of losing his brother to a life that now seemed completely separate from his own. The ultimatum was as much about drawing a final boundary as it was about giving Harry one last chance. But if Harry refused to comply, was William truly ready to shut the door forever? The emotional toll extended beyond the immediate family. Queen Camilla, Princess Kate, and other senior royals had all been drawn into the conflict, whether they wanted to be or not. Kate, in particular, had been one of the key figures caught in the middle. Once close to Harry, she had now found herself portrayed in a negative light in Meghan's revelations. The tension between Meghan and Kate had become symbolic of the broader divide between the two couples, and despite any personal feelings she may have had, Kate was expected to stand by William's side. The ultimatum was a moment of reckoning for everyone involved. It was no longer just about words or accusations. It was about making a definitive choice that would shape the future of the royal family for years to come. Would emotions win out over duty? Would past wounds ever be fully healed? Or had too much been said, too much been exposed, for any real reconciliation to ever take place? No matter what happened next, the emotional scars left behind by this battle would remain long after the public had moved on to the next headline. And for those at the heart of this storm, the pain of what was lost might never fully fade. The ultimatum issued to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was not just about a family dispute. It was about the future of the British monarchy. The royal family was at a crossroads, facing challenges that extended far beyond the tension between two brothers or the hurt feelings of a disappointed father. This was about survival, about ensuring that the monarchy remained relevant in a rapidly changing world. For centuries, the British monarchy had endured wars, revolutions, scandals, and shifting political landscapes, yet it had always managed to maintain its place in society. But in the modern era, where public opinion could be shaped in an instant through social media and viral headlines, the institution faced threats unlike any before. The controversy surrounding Harry and Meghan had exposed deep fractures within the royal system, fractures that could no longer be hidden behind palace walls. One of the most pressing concerns was the question of public trust. The monarchy's strength had always relied on the support of the people. Without it, the institution had no real power, no real purpose. In the past, royal scandals had been met with carefully managed public relations strategies, often relying on time and silence to allow controversies to fade. But Harry and Meghan's very public battle against the royal family had made that strategy impossible. With every interview, every documentary, and every new revelation, more questions arose about whether the monarchy was still a force for stability or merely a relic of the past, struggling to stay relevant. Younger generations, in particular, were becoming increasingly indifferent to the idea of a royal family. Polls in the UK showed that while older generations still valued the monarchy, younger people were far less convinced of its necessity. The Harry and Meghan controversy had only accelerated this shift. Many young people saw the couple as symbols of change, individuals who had dared to break away from an institution that appeared outdated and resistant to progress. To them, the royal family's handling of the situation, issuing an ultimatum rather than engaging in meaningful dialogue, was just another sign that the monarchy was unwilling to adapt. In contrast, more traditional royal supporters viewed the ultimatum as a much-needed stand, a demonstration that the monarchy would not be dictated to by former members who had chosen to walk away. They saw it as a necessary action to reinforce the idea that being a royal came with responsibilities, and that one could not simply use the institution for personal gain while simultaneously attacking it. But the challenge for the royal family was that it could not afford to alienate either group. It needed to maintain the support of its traditional base while also convincing younger generations that it still had a place in the modern world. That balancing act was becoming increasingly difficult, and the way the monarchy handled this crisis would shape its reputation for years to come. The implications of the ultimatum also extended beyond Britain. Many Commonwealth nations had been questioning their ties to the monarchy, with some already taking steps toward becoming republics. Countries like Barbados had already removed the British monarch as their head of state, and others, including Australia and Canada, were openly debating whether they should follow suit. The way the royal family managed its internal conflicts played a significant role in these discussions. If the monarchy appeared dysfunctional and out of touch, it only fueled the argument that Commonwealth nations had little reason to remain under its symbolic rule. The Harry and Meghan saga, with its themes of racial tension, outdated traditions, and resistance to change, had given Republican movements in these countries new momentum. King Charles III, in particular, faced immense pressure. Unlike Queen Elizabeth II, who had decades of stability to solidify her reign, Charles was still in the process of defining his leadership. He had inherited a monarchy that was already struggling with questions of relevance, and the ongoing feud with his youngest son was making it even harder to present a united, forward-thinking institution. For Prince William, the stakes were even higher. As the future king, his role was not just about leading the monarchy in the present, it was about ensuring that it had a future at all. Every decision he made now would shape the monarchy he would eventually inherit. That was why the ultimatum mattered so much to him. He saw it as a way to establish boundaries, to reinforce the idea that the monarchy could not be turned into a spectacle for personal gain. But in taking such a firm stance, was he also pushing his brother away for good? That was the paradox at the heart of this crisis. The royal family wanted to protect itself, yet in doing so, it risked permanently losing a key member who still held significant public influence. Harry's popularity, especially outside the UK, remained strong. He was seen as a relatable, modern figure who had chosen to put his family and mental health above duty. His willingness to speak openly about personal struggles, mental health, and the pressures of royal life had resonated with many. If the royal family completely severed ties with him, would it make them seem even more out of touch? Would it reinforce the very criticisms that Harry and Meghan had voiced? The media's role in this saga also could not be ignored. The British press had long been both a protector and a critic of the monarchy, shaping public perception in ways that often influenced royal decisions. Throughout the controversy, different media outlets had taken sides, with some defending the royal family and others championing Harry and Meghan's right to speak out. The palace had always understood the power of the press, which was why it had maintained a careful relationship with the media for decades. But Harry and Meghan had disrupted that dynamic, choosing instead to speak directly to the public through their own platforms. That shift had weakened the palace's control over the narrative, making it harder to manage crises in the traditional way. So what did all of this mean for the future of the monarchy? If Harry and Meghan chose to comply with the ultimatum, it would mark a temporary resolution, but the damage would still linger. The public would continue to question the sincerity of any reconciliation, and the monarchy would still have to work to repair its reputation. If they refused, the royal family would have to decide how far it was willing to go in enforcing consequences. Stripping Harry and Meghan of their remaining royal titles, cutting off all contact, and making a final, irreversible break would be a dramatic move, one that could either strengthen the monarchy's position or make it seem even colder and more unyielding. But beyond these immediate decisions, the monarchy faced a deeper challenge, proving that it was still relevant in a world that was rapidly changing. Could it modernize without losing the traditions that gave it its identity? Could it balance duty with the need to be emotionally responsive? And most importantly, could it survive the growing sentiment that its time had passed? The ultimatum to Harry and Meghan was about much more than an apology or a ceasefire. It was about defining what the monarchy stood for in the 21st century. And as the world watched, one thing was clear. The decisions made now would shape the royal family for generations to come. Would it evolve, or would it resist? Would it heal, or would it break apart even further? The answers were not yet clear, but one truth remained. The monarchy could never go back to the way things were before. The past had already changed it forever. As the dust settled on the royal family's ultimatum to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the world remained fixated on what would happen next. The monarchy had made its stance clear. An apology and an end to public disclosures were non-negotiable. Anything less would mean permanent estrangement. It was a defining moment, not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the future of the British monarchy itself. The ultimatum had forced everyone involved into a moment of reckoning. For Harry and Meghan, it was about whether they could, in good conscience, comply with demands that went against everything they had fought for. For King Charles III, it was about whether he was truly prepared to cut off his son for the sake of preserving royal tradition. For Prince William, it was about proving that the monarchy could not be undermined without consequences. No matter what decision was made, the outcome would leave lasting scars. If Harry and Meghan chose to comply, they would have to reconcile with the idea that their public fight against the monarchy had reached its limit. It would mean stepping away from the brand they had built, one that was deeply tied to their royal departure. They would have to shift their focus to other ventures, rebranding themselves in a way that did not rely on royal controversy. For years, their story had been their strongest asset. The interviews, the memoirs, the documentaries, they had all been fueled by the narrative of a young prince escaping an institution that had failed him. If that narrative was suddenly silenced, what would be left? Would the public still be interested? Even more pressing was the question of sincerity. If Harry and Meghan apologized, would it be seen as genuine? Or would it be viewed as a strategic move to maintain ties to the royal family? Would the British public accept their return? Or would they be forever seen as outsiders who had betrayed the institution they once belonged to? On the other hand, if they refused, they would be making a statement that there was no longer any hope for reconciliation. They would be accepting a life fully separated from the monarchy, one where their children would never truly know their royal heritage beyond what the history books would tell them. A refusal would also mean preparing for potential consequences. The royal family might respond by formally stripping them of their titles, further distancing them from the institution. Financial ties, if any remained, would be cut, and all future interactions would be handled with cold formality, if at all. For Charles, the choice was just as painful. As a father, he had already endured years of distance from his youngest son. He had watched as Harry moved across the world, built a new life, and openly criticized the family that Charles had spent his entire life upholding. And yet, despite everything, Charles had never publicly condemned Harry in the way many expected. The ultimatum suggested that he was finally taking a stand, asserting the authority that came with the crown. But deep down, did Charles truly want to lose Harry forever? No matter how much tension existed, no matter how many public betrayals had taken place, Harry was still his son. The thought of going the rest of his reign without speaking to him, without seeing his grandchildren, was something that could not be easily dismissed. For William, the situation was even more complicated. Unlike Charles, whose primary focus was ensuring a smooth transition for his reign, William was thinking about the long-term survival of the monarchy. As the future king, he could not afford to let emotions dictate his decisions. To William, this was not just about personal grievances. It was about reinforcing the idea that the monarchy was bigger than any individual. Harry's actions had, in his eyes, weakened the institution, creating a level of scrutiny that threatened its stability. If the monarchy was to survive, it had to demonstrate strength. But even as he stood by the ultimatum, there was an undeniable sense of loss. This was the same brother he had once been inseparable from, the one who had stood beside him through childhood, through their mother's death, through years of navigating royal duties together. The idea that their bond could be irreparably broken was not something he had ever imagined. So where did that leave things? Would the royal family truly enforce the ultimatum if Harry and Meghan refused? Or was there still room for negotiation? The reality was that even if the Sussexes rejected the monarchy's demands, the royal family would have to tread carefully. Completely severing ties with Harry and Meghan might bring a sense of short-term resolution, but it would also come with long-term risks. The more isolated Harry felt, the more likely he would be to continue speaking out. And if he had nothing left to lose, his disclosures might become even more damaging. At the same time, maintaining a strained but open relationship might allow for the possibility of reconciliation years down the line. The royal family had been through conflicts before. Time had a way of changing perspectives, of making once unthinkable reunions possible. Perhaps this ultimatum was less about enforcing a permanent break and more about drawing a clear boundary, one that could be revisited in the future if both sides were willing. For the public, the question of reconciliation or permanent estrangement was just as divisive as ever. Some believed that the royal family needed to remain firm, that bending for Harry and Meghan would only set a precedent that royals could abandon their duties without consequence. Others believed that cutting off Harry entirely would only make the monarchy appear heartless, reinforcing the very criticisms that had fueled this conflict in the first place. For Harry and Meghan's supporters, this was a defining moment in their journey. Would they continue to stand against the institution, proving that they had never needed royal approval to succeed? Or would they attempt to mend fences, showing that despite everything, they still valued their family ties? And for those who had always defended the royal family, this was a test of the monarchy's strength. Would it show resilience, standing by its traditions no matter the personal cost? Or would it soften, risking its authority for the sake of familial peace? In the end, there was no perfect outcome. No matter what Harry and Meghan decided, the events of the past few years had already changed the monarchy forever. The royal family could never return to the time before Harry and Meghan's departure, before the Oprah interview, before Spare, before the Netflix docuseries. The damage had been done. But perhaps the real question was not about whether the monarchy could repair itself. Perhaps the real question was whether it even needed to. For centuries, the monarchy had survived because it adapted, sometimes slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but always with the understanding that survival required evolution. Would this be the moment it finally acknowledged that the world had changed? Or would it hold on to its traditions, no matter the cost? As the world waited for Harry and Meghan's response, one thing was certain: there was no going back. The monarchy had drawn its line. Now, The Sussexes had to decide whether to cross it or walk away forever. And whichever choice they made, history would remember this moment as one that reshaped the British monarchy forever.